Before we unlock the secrets buried beneath the manicured lawns of 1960s suburbia, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden history of the Cold War and the ordinary people caught in its crosshairs, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. It helps us bring these forgotten archives to light. The rain in October of 1961 didn't just fall, it dismantled the autumn. In the quiet, leafy enclave of Silver Spring, Maryland, a suburb that prided itself on the geometric precision of its hedges and the reliability of its paperboys, the storm was an intrusion. It was the tail end of a hurricane system that had lost its name but kept its fury, stalling over the mid-Atlantic and turning the clay-heavy soil into a shifting liquid mess. For Thomas Miller, a 34-year-old actuary for a mid-sized insurance firm, the storm was a logistical headache. Thomas was a man who found comfort in variables he could control. He liked his coffee percolated for exactly 7 minutes. He liked his shirt starched to a specific stiffness. And he liked his backyard, a modest quarter-acre abutting a patch of dense woods, to be immaculate. But the morning after the storm, the backyard was a disaster zone. A massive oak branch had sheared off, taking a section of the white picket fence with it, and the heavy wash of water coming down the slope from the woods had cut a new, jagged ravine through his flower beds. Thomas stood on his back porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands against the dawn chill, surveying the damage. The air smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and that peculiar metallic scent that follows a heavy electrical storm. He sighed, the sound lost in the damp air, and went to the garage to fetch his boots and a shovel. It was while he was digging out the drainage ditch, ankle-deep in mud that sucked at his rubber boots, that his shovel struck something hard. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting a rock or a tree root. It was a hollow metallic clank that vibrated up the wooden handle and into his palms. Thomas paused, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a gloved hand. He assumed it was trash, perhaps a paint can left over from the previous owners, buried and forgotten. He dug around the object, carefully leveraging the mud away. It was boxy, roughly the size of a toaster, and caked in years of compacted red clay and rust. He pulled it free with a grunt of effort. The object was heavy, far heavier than a paint can. He carried it to the patio table and hosed it off. As the layers of mud sluiced away, the object revealed itself to be a metal casing, corroded and pitted, but clearly manufactured. It had dials. It had switches fused by rust. It had a telescoping antenna that had snapped off at the base. It looked like a radio, but not one you would buy at Sears. It didn't have the polished wood veneer of a living room console, or the bright plastic casing of the portable transistor radios that teenagers were starting to carry around. This was industrial, utilitarian. It was painted a dull, flaking olive green. Thomas was an amateur tinkerer. In his basement, he had a workbench cluttered with soldering irons, vacuum tubes, and partially disassembled ham radios. He knew electronics. But as he stared at the rusted hulk on his patio table, something felt off. The layout of the knobs was counterintuitive. The inputs were shielded in a way he hadn't seen on domestic gear. He turned the box over. On the bottom plate, barely visible through the oxidation, was a serial number stamped into the metal. But it wasn't the alphanumeric sequence he was used to seeing on American electronics. The font was blocky, severe, and right next to a screw head that had stripped with age, there was a symbol that made Thomas's breath catch in his throat. It was a faint, etched marking, a star. Thomas looked up from the table. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the wet grass. The neighborhood was waking up. He could hear a car starting 2 streets over. He could see the milkman's truck idling at the corner. To his left, the house of his neighbor, Mr. Arthur Sterling, stood quiet and imposing. The blinds were drawn, as they always were. Thomas looked back at the radio. He didn't know it yet, but the rusted box sitting on his patio table was about to pull him out of his quiet life as an actuary and into the center of a silent, invisible war being fought right over his garden fence. The basement was Thomas's sanctuary. It was a space defined by the smell of ozone, sawdust, and pipe tobacco. While the rest of the Miller house was decorated in the pastel optimisms of the early 1960s, mint green appliances, floral wallpaper, the basement was a realm of raw function. He placed the scavenged device on his primary workbench, clearing away a half-finished amplifier project. Under the harsh glare of an articulated desk lamp, the radio looked even more alien. The rust was like a disease, eating away at the casing, but Thomas could see that the internal housing was remarkably intact. It had been sealed with a rubber gasket, a high-quality waterproofing that had largely held up against the elements. Thomas took a set of precision screwdrivers and began the painstaking work of opening the casing. The screws were seized, fused to the chassis by oxidation. He had to apply penetrating oil and weight, pacing the length of the basement while the chemical worked its way into the threads. He felt a strange sense of trespass. In 1961, the world was on a razor's edge. The Berlin crisis was dominating the headlines. Families were digging fallout shelters in their backyards. The word nuclear hung over every dinner table conversation like a suspended guillotine. To find a piece of military-grade hardware buried in your own yard was not an adventure. It was a violation. After an hour, the first screw gave way with a sharp crack. Then the second. When Thomas finally pried the back panel off, the smell that escaped wasn't the musty odor of damp earth. It was the sharp chemical smell of bakelite and old flux. He shone his light into the guts of the machine. His heart hammered against his ribs. He expected to find a nest of rot, wires turned to dust. Instead, he found a masterpiece of miniaturization. The vacuum tubes were smaller than any he could buy at the local supply store. The wiring was bundled with wax-impregnated twine, knotted with obsessive precision. But it was the components themselves that froze him. Thomas had spent years building radios. He knew the brands: RCA, General Electric, Zenith. He knew the markings of American capacitors and resistors. The components inside this box bore none of those marks. The vacuum tubes were stamped with Cyrillic characters: L, L, P, P, G, ZH. He grabbed a magnifying glass, leaning in so close his nose almost touched the circuitry. On a large transformer, stamped in fading white ink, was a date: 1958. This wasn't World War II surplus. This wasn't a relic from an ally. This was modern Soviet technology, buried in the mud of a Maryland suburb, less than 20 miles from the White House. Thomas sat back on his stool, his hands trembling slightly. He reached for his pipe, packing the bowl with mechanical, jerky movements. He lit it, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs, trying to steady his nerves. Why was it there? The drainage ditch where he found it had been carved out by the storm, eroding a section of the slope that led up toward the woods. The object hadn't been buried in his yard. It had washed down into his yard. It had come from higher up, from the woods, or from the property that bordered the woods at the top of the rise. Thomas closed his eyes and visualized the geography of the neighborhood. His lot was at the bottom of a gentle hill. Directly behind him was the dense tree line. But cutting through the woods, sitting on a slightly elevated plateau that looked down over Thomas's property, was the rear boundary of the Sterling estate. Arthur Sterling. The man was a ghost in a neighborhood of socialites. While other men in the subdivision joined bowling leagues and hosted barbecues, Sterling kept to himself. He was a tall, gaunt man, perhaps in his 50s, with a posture that seemed permanently rigid. He drove a gray sedan, always kept perfectly clean. He left at 8 a.m. sharp and returned at 6 p.m. The neighborhood gossip, fueled by the bored housewives of the cul-de-sac, was that Sterling worked for the government. Logistics, he had once told Thomas over the fence, a word so broad it meant nothing. He was polite, but his politeness was a wall, not a door. Thomas looked back at the Soviet radio. It was a receiver, he realized as he traced the circuit path. It wasn't built to transmit, it was built to listen. And it was built to listen to a specific frequency range that was nowhere near the commercial broadcast bands. He needed to know if it still worked. It was a reckless thought. A smarter man would have called the police immediately. A smarter man would have driven the box to the nearest FBI field office. But curiosity is a powerful narcotic. Thomas wanted to know what the ghost machine had been listening to. He spent the next 6 hours cleaning the contacts with isopropyl alcohol. He replaced the frayed power cord with a spare from his supply. He bypassed the rusted battery terminals and rigged a direct DC power supply from his bench. It was 2 a.m. when he was finally ready. The house above him was silent. His wife, Martha, was asleep, unaware that her husband was about to resurrect a piece of the iron curtain in their basement. Thomas put on his headphones. He reached out and flipped the toggle switch on the front of the rusted box. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a low hum. The amber glow of the miniature vacuum tubes flickered to life, warming the cold air of the basement. Static washed over him, the cosmic background noise of the universe. He turned the tuning dial. The mechanism was gritty, but it moved. He swept through the frequencies, his eyes glued to the signal strength meter. Nothing. Just the hiss of empty air. He was about to turn it off, convinced the internal crystals were shattered, when he heard it. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't music. It was a rhythmic mechanical chirping, a burst of data, fast, precise. Dit-dit-da-dit, dit-da-da, Morse code. But it was too fast for a human hand. It was a machine transmission, high-speed telegraphy, and it was coming in loud. The signal wasn't bouncing off the ionosphere from Moscow. The signal strength meter was pegged to the far right. The source wasn't thousands of miles away. The source was close, terrifyingly close. The next morning, the world looked deceptively normal. The sun was drying the mud in the yard. The birds were singing with annoying cheerfulness. But for Thomas, the lens through which he viewed his life had fractured. He stood at his kitchen window, sipping black coffee, staring up at the wooded hill. Through the thinning autumn leaves, he could just make out the second-story windows of the Sterling house. Arthur Sterling was a man of routine. Thomas knew this because, in the suburbs, knowing your neighbor's routine was a form of social currency. You knew when the Johnsons were fighting, you knew when the Millers were on vacation, and you knew when Mr. Sterling washed his car. At 9 a.m. on a Saturday, Sterling usually sat on his back patio reading the newspaper. Thomas watched. Sure enough, the sliding glass door opened. Sterling stepped out. He was wearing a cardigan despite the mild weather and holding a thick stack of papers. He sat down, crossed his legs, and began to read. He looked unremarkable. He looked like a grandfather, a retired accountant, a man whose biggest worry was crabgrass. But Thomas had the radio in his basement. He had the Cyrillic tubes. He had the signal that had screamed through his headphones at 2 a.m. Thomas decided he needed to test the waters. He needed to get close to Sterling, to look him in the eye and see if there was a crack in the facade. "I'm going to return that rake I borrowed," Thomas announced to Martha, who was frying eggs. "That was 6 months ago, Tom," she said, not looking up from the skillet. "I think he's forgotten about it." "Better late than never," he muttered. He walked out the back door, carrying a rusty garden rake that he had, in fact, borrowed the previous spring. He walked up the slope, navigating the treacherous footing of the damp leaves. As he approached the property line, a subtle transition where the wild woods met manicured lawn, his heart began to thud in his chest. Sterling didn't look up until Thomas was halfway across the lawn. "Morning, Arthur," Thomas called out, forcing a jovial tone that sounded fake to his own ears. Sterling lowered the paper slowly. He had a face that seemed carved from granite, deep lines, pale eyes, and a mouth that rested in a natural frown. "Thomas," Sterling said. His voice was dry, like paper rustling. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Just returning the rake," Thomas said, holding up the tool. "Found it in the shed, felt guilty keeping it this long." Sterling stared at the rake, then at Thomas. For a second, Thomas felt like he was being X-rayed. "I hadn't missed it," Sterling said. "But thank you." Thomas didn't leave. He stood there, shifting his weight. "Quite a storm we had, didn't we?" "Indeed," Sterling said, folding his newspaper. "Nature has a way of reminding us of our lack of control." "Did you lose anything?" Thomas asked. The question hung in the air, heavy and clumsy. "I had a fence panel come down, found a lot of debris washed down from the woods." Sterling's eyes narrowed. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes. "Debris?" "Just junk," Thomas said quickly. "Old cans? Trash?" The water really carved a channel out there. Sterling stood up. He was taller than Thomas remembered. "I haven't inspected the tree line yet. I suppose I should. If any of my refuse has ended up on your property, I apologize." "Oh, no need," Thomas said. "I cleaned it up." You cleaned it up? Sterling took a step forward. Did you find anything specific? The air on the patio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Thomas realized he had made a mistake. He was playing poker against a man who did this for a living, while he was just an actuary who liked radios. Just junk, Thomas repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. Broken glass, rusted metal. I took it all to the dump this morning. A lie, a dangerous lie. If Sterling checked the dump, if he checked Thomas's trash cans. Sterling held his gaze for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then the tension evaporated, replaced by a thin, synthetic smile. Well, Sterling said, that is very neighborly of you, Thomas, saving me the trouble. It's what neighbors are for, Thomas said. Yes, Sterling said, turning back to his house. It is. As Thomas walked back down the hill, he could feel Sterling's eyes on his back. He didn't run, though every instinct in his body screamed at him to flee. When he finally got back inside his own kitchen, his shirt was soaked through with sweat. He went straight to the basement. He didn't take the radio to the dump. He hid it. He wrapped it in an old canvas tarp and shoved it behind the furnace, behind a stack of holiday decorations. He knew two things now. First, Arthur Sterling was not just a logistics manager. The intensity in his eyes when Thomas mentioned debris was the reaction of a man protecting a secret. Second, the radio wasn't just trash, it was evidence. And by telling Sterling he had found rusted metal, Thomas had unwittingly signaled that he might know something. The game had begun, and Thomas was playing with a distinct disadvantage. He didn't know the rules. Paranoia is a slow-acting poison. For the next 3 days, Thomas went to work, sat at his desk, crunched numbers on mortality rates and premiums, but his mind was back in Silver Spring. Every time the phone rang, he jumped. Every time a car drove slowly past the office, he watched it until it turned the corner. He began to educate himself. He spent his lunch breaks at the public library, reading everything he could find on radio technology, espionage, and the current state of Soviet electronics. He learned about dead drops, places where agents left items for one another to avoid direct contact. He learned about burst transmitters, devices that recorded a message and then blasted it out in a split second to minimize the chance of triangulation. The radio he found was likely a receiver for such bursts, a way for an agent deep in enemy territory to receive complex instructions without sitting at a radio for hours, exposing themselves to direction-finding trucks. On Wednesday night, Thomas couldn't sleep. He went down to the basement. He pulled the radio out from behind the furnace. He needed to understand the signal. He set up a reel-to-reel tape recorder next to the Soviet device. He connected the audio output of the radio to the input of the recorder. He turned them both on. He sat in the dark, the green glow of the vacuum tubes the only light, waiting. He tuned the dial to the frequency where he had heard the signal before. It was a guard band, a sliver of the radio spectrum that was supposed to be empty, wedged between military aviation channels. 2 AM passed, nothing. 3 AM, nothing. Thomas's eyelids were heavy. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe the agent, Sterling, had realized the equipment was lost and had changed frequencies. Then, at 3:17 AM, the needle jumped. Screech, chirp, hiss. It lasted less than 4 seconds. A tear in the fabric of the static. Thomas hit the stop button on the recorder. His hands were shaking. He rewound the tape. He played it back. The sound was high-pitched, garbled. It sounded like a cassette tape being fast-forwarded. He needed to slow it down. Thomas didn't have sophisticated cryptographic equipment, but he had ingenuity. He manually spun the reels of the recorder, dragging the tape across the playhead at a fraction of the normal speed. The screech stretched out. It elongated into distinct tones. Da, dit, da. Morse code. Groups of 5 numbers. 45921, 88302, 111945. It was a numbers station transmission, compressed for speed. These were instructions, orders. Thomas grabbed a notepad and a pencil. He played the tape over and over, transcribing the numbers. He filled 3 pages. When he was done, he stared at the strings of digits. They were meaningless without the key. A one-time pad cipher was mathematically unbreakable unless you had the matching pad. But the content didn't matter as much as the timing. The transmission had come in at 3:17 a.m. Thomas ran up the stairs to the kitchen. He kept the lights off, crawling across the linoleum floor to peek out the window toward the Sterling house. The house was dark, but then a faint light appeared in the basement window of the Sterling estate. It was a red light, like a photography darkroom. It pulsed once, twice, then vanished. Acknowledgement. Sterling had received the message, but he hadn't used the rusty radio Thomas found. That was an old unit, a discard. Sterling must have a newer, functional unit inside the house. Thomas realized the implications. The rusty radio was a receiver. It was likely buried by Sterling years ago as a backup, or perhaps it was part of a cache that had been washed out by the storm. Sterling was active. He was receiving orders from Moscow right now. Thomas went back to the basement. He looked at the transcript of numbers. He couldn't read the message, but he could analyze the signal. The strength was massive. Wait, if the signal strength on the rusty receiver was peaking, it meant the transmitter was close. But this was a reception. The signal should be coming from a high-power transmitter in international waters, or a diplomat's car, or unless it wasn't a reception from Moscow, unless the rusty radio was picking up the local oscillator of Sterling's receiver. Radios leak. When a receiver is turned on and tuned to a specific frequency, it generates a tiny, low-power signal of its own. If you are close enough, like next-door neighbor close, you can hear someone else's radio listening. Thomas realized he hadn't heard the order coming from Moscow. He had heard the electronic squeal of Sterling's equipment decoding the burst. He had a way to track him. For the next 2 weeks, Thomas lived a double life. By day, he calculated risk for the insurance company. By night, he became a surveillance officer in his own basement. He built a better antenna. He ran a wire from the basement up through the heating vents, into the attic and along the eaves of his roof, pointing it directionally at the Sterling house. He kept a logbook. October 24th, 02 Mount AM, signal detected, duration 3 seconds. October 26th, 02:15 AM, signal detected, duration 5 seconds. October 29th, 01:45 AM, signal detected. He began to correlate the radio activity with physical observations. Thomas started calling in sick to work. He spent his days sitting in his guest bedroom with a pair of bird-watching binoculars, observing the Sterling house through the slats of the blinds. He noticed the triggers. On the days when a transmission occurred at night, Sterling would do something specific in the morning. He would open the blinds in his living room exactly halfway, or he would place a seemingly random object on the front porch railing, a flower pot, a milk bottle, a folded newspaper. These were signals. I am ready to receive, or message received. But the most chilling pattern emerged on Tuesdays. Every Tuesday at 6:45 p.m., Sterling would leave the house. He wouldn't take his car. He would walk. He would carry a canvas tote bag. He would walk down the hill, past Thomas's house, and head toward the community park 3 blocks away. Thomas decided it was time to leave the basement. It was a Tuesday in early November. The air was crisp, smelling of burning leaves. Thomas waited until Sterling had passed his house. He gave him a 2-minute lead. Then, wearing a dark coat and a flat cap pulled low, Thomas slipped out the back door. He didn't take the sidewalk. He cut through the backyards of his neighbors, moving like a thief through the shadows of swing sets and tool sheds. He knew the terrain. He knew which dogs barked and which fences had loose boards. He emerged at the edge of the park. It was a small park, just a baseball diamond and a few benches surrounding a duck pond. The streetlights buzzed overhead, casting pools of sickly yellow light. Thomas crouched behind a line of oak trees. He saw Sterling. Sterling was sitting on a bench near the pond. The canvas bag was at his feet. He was feeding the ducks, tossing bread crusts into the dark water. He looked for all the world like a lonely old man finding solace in nature. But Thomas watched the bag. 10 minutes passed. Then a woman approached. She was young, maybe 30, pushing a stroller. She looked exhausted, like any other mother out for a late stroll to get a fussy baby to sleep. She stopped at the bench. She didn't look at Sterling. She adjusted the blanket on the baby. As she did, Sterling stood up. He left the canvas bag on the ground. The woman sat down. Sterling walked away. He didn't look back. The woman waited a full minute. Then, casually, she reached down and picked up the bag. She placed it in the basket underneath the stroller. She stood up and walked in the opposite direction. The handoff was seamless, silent, professional. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. This wasn't just a radio enthusiast listening to numbers. This was a network. This was physical espionage. That bag could contain anything. Microfilm, stolen blueprints, lists of names. He watched the woman disappear into the darkness. He watched Sterling's retreating figure. Thomas realized he was in way over his head. He wasn't just observing, he was witnessing a felony, perhaps treason. He turned to head back, stepping carefully to avoid snapping a twig. Crunch. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet park. Sterling stopped walking. He was 50 yards away, under a streetlight. He turned around slowly. He scanned the darkness of the tree line where Thomas was crouching. Thomas held his breath. He pressed himself against the rough bark of the oak tree. He closed his eyes, as if that would make him invisible. Sterling stood there for a long time. Then, he took a step toward the trees. Then another. He was coming to check. Thomas had never run from a fight, but he had never been hunted by a spy either. As Sterling moved toward the trees, Thomas made a calculation. If he ran, the noise would give him away instantly. If he stayed, he would be found. He needed a diversion. He reached into his pocket and found a handful of loose change. He waited until Sterling was 20 yards away. Thomas threw the coins hard to his left, aiming for a metal trash can near the baseball diamond. Clatter-clang, Sterling's head snapped toward the noise. In that split second of distraction, Thomas moved. He didn't run away. He ran deeper into the shadows, circling back toward the residential street, keeping the tree trunks between him and Sterling. He didn't stop moving until he was in his own backyard, lungs burning, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He slipped inside the kitchen, locked the door, and slid down to the floor, gasping for air. He checked his watch. 7:22 p.m. He stayed on the floor for an hour, listening. Every car that passed sounded like a threat. Every creak of the house settling sounded like a footstep on the porch. At 8:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. Thomas froze. Martha was in the living room watching television. "I'll get it," she called out cheerfully. "No!" Thomas shouted, scrambling to his feet. He rushed into the hallway, intercepting Martha just as she reached for the knob. "I've got it," he said, breathless. Martha looked at him, concerned. "Tom, you look pale. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Go back to your show." He waited for her to sit back down. Then he opened the door. Arthur Sterling was standing on the porch. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a pie dish. "Good evening, Thomas," Sterling said. His voice was smooth, devoid of the suspicion that had been there in the park. But his eyes were cold, dead cold. "Arthur," Thomas said. He blocked the doorway with his body. "I made a surplus of apple crumble," Sterling said, lifting the dish slightly. "I thought you and Martha might enjoy it. A peace offering for the debris from the storm." It was a test. Sterling was checking to see if Thomas was home, to see if Thomas was out of breath, to see if Thomas looked like a man who had just been crouching in a park. "That's very generous," Thomas said. He didn't reach for the pie. Sterling looked at Thomas's shoes. Thomas looked down. His boots were covered in fresh mud, the same mud found in the park. Sterling's gaze moved back up to Thomas's face. The synthetic smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You've been out?" Sterling asked softly. "Just taking out the trash." Thomas lied. "Slipped in the garden." "Careful," Sterling said. "It's dangerous in the dark. You never know what you might trip over." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "I'll keep that in mind," Thomas said. "Do enjoy the crumble," Sterling said, pushing the dish into Thomas's hands. "It's a family recipe." From the old country. Sterling turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Thomas closed the door and locked it. He engaged the deadbolt. Then he put the chain across. He looked at the pie. It smelled of cinnamon and apples. It looked delicious. He walked into the kitchen and dumped the entire thing into the garbage disposal. He turned on the water and the blades, grinding the peace offering into paste. He couldn't do this alone anymore. The radio in the basement wasn't a curiosity. It was a target. And now Sterling knew. Maybe not for sure, but he suspected. And a man like Sterling didn't need proof to act. He only needed suspicion. Thomas needed the FBI. But going to the FBI in 1961 wasn't simple. If he was wrong, he would ruin a man's life. If he was right, he might be ruining his own. Dragged into trials, hearings, his name plastered in the papers. He went to the basement one last time. He turned on the rusty radio. He tuned it to the guard band. There was no signal tonight, just the hiss. But as he reached to turn it off, he noticed something. The tape recorder he had left connected. It was running. He hadn't turned it on. He rewound the tape. He put on the headphones. He heard the sound of the basement door opening, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of breathing. Then a voice, whispering close to the microphone. "Curiosity killed the cat, Thomas." The tape ended with the sound of the door closing. Someone had been in his house while he was at the park. While he was watching Sterling, someone else, an accomplice, had been watching him. Thomas ripped the headphones off. He wasn't the hunter. He was the prey.